What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 10 of season 1 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Season 1 is looking at deliberative mini-publics from a number of different angles. In episode 1, I spoke to Professor Carson to learn more about what a deliberative mini-public is. And in episode 2, I spoke with Associate Professor Helene Landemore to understand why deliberative mini-publics work. In episode 3, we heard a politician's perspective from the Premier of South Australia, Jay Weatherill, and in episode 4, a number of people shared their views on why deliberative mini-publics are so popular at the moment. The following 4 episodes covered different approaches to the design and delivery of deliberative mini-publics in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Future episodes will continue to look at the design and delivery of mini-publics around the world, including in the US and in Europe. With the growth in popularity of deliberative mini-publics, there has been an increased demand for people to facilitate these processes. In today's episode, I speak to 2 such people, Emily Jenke from Democracy Co in South Australia and Titus Alexander from Democracy Matters in the UK. Emily Jenke has been facilitating community engagement processes for many years, most recently moving into supporting deliberative processes. Emily was in the midst of facilitating one of Australia's largest deliberative mini-publics, with 350 people considering the future of nuclear fuel storage in South Australia. This process has now completed, and I'll include some links to the process and outcomes in the show notes for this episode on the website at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. I opened by asking Emily to describe her job.
That's a really good question. My job, well, it's, today is a really good example. It's partly working and helping citizens influence decision-making. It's often with government. So part of what I've been doing today is helping government let go and relax and trust citizens. We do work that is, I'm a facilitator, so I stand in front of groups. I negotiate and work with clients. That's a really, really hard question to answer, but so it goes to what we do at Democracy Co, which is effectively to help people share in the decision-making process.
That sounds like such a good aim. And how long have you worked in this field?
I've been working as a facilitator for 20 years now, and probably over the last 8 or 9 years have been doing more of what we call deliberative democracy, so much more different processes, I suppose, that actually put citizens at the front end of the decision-making process, as opposed to a stock standard community engagement where generally citizens are commenting on the work of someone else. Probably in the last 10 years, I've actually been working more and more often with the public who are raising dilemmas and then starting to scope up solutions on their own.
You've sort of preempted my next question, which is, can you describe the difference between deliberative mini-public processes and more traditional citizens' engagement?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's pretty simple, and it's the challenge that we have every single day on every single project. And without generalising too much, the government generally will, and most of our work is with government, so I'll use that as an example, draw on that as a lot as an example, but government generally think and believe that they know the answer to the problems that they're facing. And what we believe is that they actually need to tap into the wisdom of the crowd, both to define the problem and then to come up with the multiple ways to solve it. So deliberative democracy always, in my experience, is dealing with very complex issues or opportunities that cut across sort of facts and realities into ethics and morals and values and social needs, environmental needs. So this really complex space space where decisions are required is where deliberative democracy shines, as opposed to general community engagement, which is often just about feedback.
From your perspective as a facilitator, what is the difference in the room? What are you doing differently?
Oh, the difference in the room is that it's citizen-led, so the participants, who are generally randomly selected members of the public, lead the process. So we're working on a citizens jury at the moment, and we're right in the middle of it, and at the critical point for the citizen-led bit in which the community or the citizens get to choose their witnesses or the people that they trust to provide them with answers to the questions that they've got. And so in the room, what happens is that, and this is where it gets tricky with a client, which is often a government department, but citizens actually say, no, we trust person A, whereas government might trust person B. And we often have to do a lot of work with government to help them understand the importance of citizens choosing those experts. The other citizen-led elements are often, and a citizens jury is a good example, are about when they're ready to stop hearing evidence and when they need to start deliberating, who's allowed in the room and to influence them, the shape and form of the work, the product that they come out with, the report that they write. So every single aspect of a deliberative process has that one central theme of being citizen-led.
Okay, so generally speaking, do clients come to you asking for a deliberative process, or do you recommend them because of an issue or topic that you think is particularly suited?
Yeah, we do both, and we find that both is really, the most effective thing for our business. So we'll be looking at what's happening in either our local state or our country and decide whether we think that issue lends itself to a deliberative process. We've had a few times where we've approached government and they have they've welcomed that approach and they've had a go at a deliberative approach. More often than not, at the moment, we're actually getting clients come to us. As I said before, they're generally government, although we've just been doing some work in the private sector as well. And the common thread is that they're faced with a problem that is complex in nature, and generally there are a whole bunch of politics around it. They might be really proper politics around it, or I suppose tension and media interest around the topics. So generally they come to us and say, we've got a problem and we'd like to do something deliberative, but they often don't know what that something is. So we then create it. So we might choose to run a citizens jury, or we might run a deliberative panel, or we might run a participative budgeting approach. It really it depends on I suppose the question that's being put to us.
And can you give me some examples of the work you've done with businesses? I mean, are they using deliberative mini-publics or similar processes?
Yeah, we've done, so a really good example, we've actually done our first deliberative panel, which we called it a deliberative panel, was with SA Power Networks last year in 2015. And that work was to help them develop some customer impact principles that underpin their pricing decisions. So like every state, and South Australia is a bit different in that we have got one company that manage the network of power when we've got the power on. They set pricing, and they have to set pricing in a very strategic way. It's over a 5-year period. And what they've realised in the last few years is the decisions they make around pricing have really profound effects on their customers. And we knew that they were struggling with this dilemma because we'd been talking to them, and we suggested that they run a deliberative panel to develop some principles that they could use to influence their decision-making going forward. And so that was it was a 20-person panel that met over 4 nights, and they came up with a handful of principles that SA Power Networks use. they've then called us back, and they've called us back twice to work with them in testing and using those principles. So part of our approach with that particular client, and it's in the private sector, so it's really different to working with government, but part of our approach is to help them build their deliberative muscle. So help them to get more confidence in sharing decision-making with citizens, or in that case, customers, and equipping them with some of the skills and methodology to be able to do that. And they keep coming back to us. And every time we go and do another project for them, it's of more significance to their business. So they're starting to see, as they build that muscle, how important this is for the business that they run.
More generally, do you see that there's a particular type of issue or particular topic that's particularly suited to deliberative mini-public processes?
My short answer would be wicked problems. And those wicked problems are the kinds of things that have multiple elements to them. They're not easily solvable. They have multiple interests. They, as I said before, they cut across economics, social needs, they cut across environmental needs. They often have significant ethical or moral constructs at their core. So wicked problems are the ones that, and also things that need to be solved with some urgency. So we find particularly a citizens jury can really break through a stuck issue that needs a breakthrough.
That's my experience too. So what's your view on whether there's any downsides to deliberative mini-publics?
Yeah, definitely there are. And one of the things that we try and do is it's one of the philosophies of Democracy Co is to not go first with a tool. There's a temptation, and we've had this before, where we've had a minister call us and say, I want to run a citizens jury on this particular topic. And our experience is that some deliberative processes have big profiles these days, like citizens juries, but there are many ways to do a mini-public, many ways, as you would know, Nivek. So I suppose it's not really a downside, but it's one of the big problems that we see often, where people come to us first with the tool and say, do a citizens jury on this topic, whereas we'd much prefer to go, what's the dilemma and what's the best way to approach that dilemma using a deliberative technique. Probably one of the other things that we've noticed recently, and you're probably about to, I don't know if you're going to ask me about this, but we're currently working on a really big, significant citizens jury exploring nuclear in South Australia. And the biggest challenge we have is not with the jury, it's not with the client, although that is significant, but it's actually with the public understanding the process. And so we're finding it increasingly more and more important to have a very significant sort of media and exposure and promotional awareness raising edge to these projects. Because often if you've got a tricky thing like nuclear, which affects multiple people affects every South Australian and potentially affects every Australian to some extent, it's important that citizens trust in the process which has led to the decision that's being made. And one of the big challenges that we face is just because this methodology is relatively new, and it's not new, it's being used in the last couple of years, has really ramped up, and there's just not a deep understanding of how the process runs, and therefore there's not that trust that develops around the process.
And you're quite right, Emily, that's one of the challenges from an academic perspective, because people say that they think that these processes would be trusted, and there's a little bit of evidence for that from some work in Canada, but it's a tricky one to actually get evidence for, because to ask people whether they trust it, they have to know about it. And to find the people that know about it, it is a very tricky sort of dilemma. But I think you're right, it's one of the crucial things. I've been watching the nuclear Facebook page and so on, and there's not a lot of comments, but the few that there are clearly from people who've already got an opinion on what the outcome should be, and therefore are picking on the process because they're not certain whether it'll give them the outcome that they want, which is obviously not sort of the best way to think about it, because it needs to be a bit broader than that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something that's been on our minds and increasingly becoming important in what we do, and every project we are now demanding that the client invest in some way in raising awareness about the process. And we've found some really cool ways to do that. And, some projects have lots of money and big budgets, others don't. And that's where we have to get creative, because if a decision is being made that affects you and you haven't been involved in it, I too would be sceptical. So we've got to find a way to simplify the process and help people understand it.
One of the things that I've come across is that people don't, as you say, people don't understand the process altogether. Actually, there is some confusion, and I think it's to do with the nature of the process, what people do know, that they think that governments are handing over decision-making power. And, I've heard people say, and I've heard politicians say, that people in the community have said to them, didn't we elect you?
To do that, yeah.
And, but no one would say that about a public meeting. They wouldn't say, why are you having a public meeting? Didn't we elect you? And so I think there's something in the nature of the citizens' jury process which people do realise is different and do realise is more in depth, and perhaps they realise that the politicians will take the recommendations more seriously, and that's why they respond to them differently than they would to another more traditional community engagement process.
That's right. And one of the things that we're doing actively on nuclear is actually we're treating all politicians the same as well, because there's a lot of scepticism by MPs in South Australia about the nuclear citizens jury, for example, and we have an open door policy. They can come to any meetings they want to. They can come to our stakeholder reference group meetings. They can be in the jury room whenever they like, whatever it takes to help them understand the process, because what we're trying to do here is move beyond, and you would have heard this a million times, Nivek, from many sources better than me. We're trying to move beyond this opinion and reaction, and to actually give people a significant amount of time to sit with a problem, have all aspects of the evidence available to them, and then to toss it up and, weigh it up and move it and shape it to come up with a solution that is generally acceptable to everyone. That's what we're trying to do. So it's actually quite hard to get that across in a 2-sentence news bite, but we're trying. We're getting there.
Oh, well, good luck. I'll be looking forward to seeing how that goes. You've mentioned yourself already, but I just wanted to ask, how do you manage the potential and real tension between what a client wants from a process and maintaining the integrity of a deliberative process? You've already mentioned an example of witness selection. Another one that comes to mind for me is the amount of time that's allocated for the process. What's your experience in that area?
So it's a really timely question, that one. It's what has been occupying my time today. I think the simple answer is transparency. So there are principles that we operate to, and there's a red line effectively that we won't go below. And often we have to find ways to satisfy our client and to also keep ourselves above that red line, so keep the integrity of the process. A really good example today with the nuclear jury, we've had the jury choose their witnesses, and guess what? The client is uncomfortable with some of them, and they're also a bit uncomfortable and a bit concerned that they think the jury have not chosen the witnesses that can provide them with some really good knowledge that they have. So we found the answer for this problem in the process that we're designing, and we're actually allocating a 1-hour session, which is a client curated session, if you like, in which they will say, look, we've been on this project exploring this issue for a long time now, and we found these bits of information are really important. You might not, but we're really keen to share them with you. So as long as we are clear and transparent with the jury that bit of the process is being run by them and being owned by them, and it's at their request, we actually don't have a problem with that. So the reality is that I don't think it's ever happened to me where a client has said, yeah, whatever, let the citizens do whatever. They've always got opinions. Some clients are much more willing to trust in the process and trust in the citizens. But when it's a high stakes game, it's actually a lot harder. So we have to keep our principles intact, and we often find the solution in the facilitated process that we design. We try and flush all this stuff out early, but as you can imagine, it's actually quite hard to do. So some of the big decisions that we have to make, like how long do we give this jury, have to happen months before the jury itself starts. So we have to be thinking about, gosh, if I was just a member of the public and I was posed with this question, how much time would I need? And then we factor in the size of the group. So generally our juries are between 30 and 50 people, but for the nuclear jury, we have 350 people in that room.
It's incredible.
And so all of a sudden we've got a scale issue where we've actually got to go, all right, even moving them from space to space takes 10 minutes. And giving them a simple instruction and having question time is just these huge time challenges. And we have to get really, really clever with the facilitation techniques that we use to make the best of that time that the jury have together.
Yes, I was pretty impressed with what I saw on the videos that were made about it, particularly that room that had them doing the speed dialogue with so many groups. It was just incredible.
Yeah, that was amazingly powerful. Like we had, I think we had 53, don't quote me on the number, 53 witnesses talk to 350 jurors in a 2-hour session. So that, it was a very energetic, and I have to get to the point quickly. And it was a really lovely spirit in the room from both the witnesses and the jurors, because they realised, and they keep realising that they're going to have to make a decision with still some questions unanswered and without having the fullness of time that they want. So if you can get them to that state of willingness, it's all go. From my perspective, it's a great outcome.
Next, I spoke with Titus Alexander, who is, amongst other things, a facilitator, educator and community capacity builder. Titus trained the other facilitators for the 2 Citizens Assembly that Professor Graham Smith described in episode 8. Unlike the processes that Emily facilitates, the Citizens Assemblies were not commissioned by governments or businesses seeking advice from citizens or customers. Rather, they were designed as demonstration projects to show how deliberative mini-publics could be used to address important political issues. To learn more about how these Citizens Assemblies were designed and delivered, listen to episode 8. Is facilitation an area that you've worked in over the years?
Very much so, in many different contexts. I've worked for charities and community organisations, and very often set up and organised facilitation events, and quite often run road shows across the country. For example, I organised 9 regional road shows on building capacity for campaigning, and facilitated those. I use a format which I've developed called Network Accelerator, and it's a way of getting people to share issues quite rapidly and what they're concerned, to prioritise, and then develop action plans around those issues. It's something you can do in a day. And I've used that method on getting work going on involving parents and schools and supporting parents. And I ran, a series, a national roadshow on those using that method. I've also done it with homeless people and on citizenship education in schools, the kind of facilitation model that I've developed about engaging people quite deeply in an issue over a short period of time.
Sounds fascinating. describe the difference between deliberative mini-public process, like the Citizens Assemblies, and more traditional citizen engagement processes.
Generally, traditional citizens engagement process engage with people who are already engaged one way or other. They generally well, there's two sorts. One is it's if you like, survey techniques, where you're using opinion polling or that kind of method to get a sample one way or other. And then there is also the more traditional community engagement methods, which in my experience tend to involve those who are already motivated. And the big difference between the Citizens Assembly type of model is that they select people on a random basis or attempt to get them on a sample basis, but engage with them more deeply over a period of time. So there is quite a significant difference.
What's your perspective on why people would use a deliberative process as opposed to a more traditional process? Like, I know the Citizens Assemblies were part of a big project that received funding and so on. But more generally, do you have a sense of why someone would use a deliberative process rather than a more traditional one? And if not, why would you recommend a deliberative process over a more traditional one?
Well, I think a deliberative process, you'd want to choose it in areas that are difficult, where there is a lot of knowledge, where people need knowledge to decide, and where you really want to engage people in some depth in understanding the issues, as well as taking an example, just getting their views. And we've just gone through the referendum, for example, for the leaving the European Union. And often, like political campaigns, the level of information is, to put it bluntly, partisan and often distorted for propaganda purposes, if you like. Whereas with a deliberative process, you're attempting to give people the best evidence on an independent basis so that they make up their mind and really engage with the information. You try to present information. Well, you may present it have different views. You may have people coming along to present the information from different standpoints, but you do your best to make sure that the best quality information is in the room and people are not just randomly selecting the information that suits them.
And what was your role with the two Citizens Assemblies? Were you involved, in a sense, with both or just one?
I was probably the only person who was actually present throughout all 4 sessions, physically in the room. And I was invited to be lead facilitator and to train the facilitators around the tables. And in my view, their role was the critical one. In other words, the assemblies took place in tables of people who had different views, and each volunteer facilitator, there were mainly students from Sheffield and Southampton University, facilitated one table, and it was their job to enable people on the table to get to know each other, to contribute equally and fully, and to enjoy the session. So for me, they were fundamental. And I think for the participants, the table was their unit for the event. So my role, as I say, was to equip them to facilitate the tables, and then to step in if there was anything that needed to support them in that role.
In your experience, are there any downsides to this sort of deliberative mini-public type process?
Well, it is time consuming. It requires people to, set aside time to take part and be willing to engage and think about the issues. But most people find that a worthwhile experience once they take that step. It does take quite a lot of effort to persuade people that it's worth giving up a day, or in this case, 4 days. So that's quite a challenge. So there is a cost involved. The other, I wouldn't say it is a downside, but I do think it's a critical issue, is what is the receptivity of decision makers to the outcome? I think it's very important that if people are taking part in an effort like this, there are people around who will receive and act on what comes out of it. And in my experience with a lot of participation and consultation and community engagement, is actually there are mechanisms for decapacitating and disempowering people in the long term, a lot of community development, because the powers that be aren't fully willing and able to take on board what comes out of them. And then people just conclude, well, what's the point?
And what was your experience with these two? Because I know that the Citizens Assemblies South actually had politicians involved. Did they take on board the outcomes from the process?
I'm sure the politicians were informed by it. I don't know, there wasn't a direct formal connection between the political process and the assemblies, because the assemblies were being done as a research project. And at the time, the hope was that a change in government would lead to a national citizens' convention on the Constitution, because two of the other parties in the election wanted that. So the view of the purpose behind these two assemblies was to pilot that process. And it was just, the local devolution processes that are taking place. It was an opportunity to do that. But I don't think they had any direct input. I mean, I haven't followed how the politicians have taken it up, but I know that the specific recommendations in terms of areas and powers aren't being followed up, because the politicians have taken a view on what the area for devolution and the powers of devolution were going to be. Yes, so I don't know where the participants are. I know that quite a number of the participants were really fired up about taking part, and they felt engaged with politics. But for them, it was a one-off event, and there hasn't been, as far as I know, any kind of follow-up apart from the Facebook group. It may well be that some of those people who got engaged have got engaged in other ways, but there wasn't a direct connection between the devolution processes and the particular assemblies.
Well, you were mentioning before that there's costs associated with running processes like this, and obviously one is the time. You touched on the difficulty in getting people to participate. Do you know what happened in this case? How was that organised?
Well, I think a key thing, first of all, the people were selected by YouGov and a polling company, and then a sample was chosen, and then they were contacted. And a very important part was the personal contact by one of the team members who rang up everybody and talked to them and encouraged them to come along, and tried to make it as easy as possible for them to take part. And then, of course, the other very important part was that just the whole way in which they were welcomed and nurtured, and it was a good hotel where they attended, and so the experience was made as positive and attractive as possible. Mm-hmm. And their importance was emphasized, the importance of their participation and their views. So I think all of that support is very important. Very important. Otherwise, you just get the people who are used to going along to things like this.
What I've asked all of the facilitators I've spoken to is whether there's anything about these sort of processes that they think people would be interested to know.
A big benefit of this kind of process is political education, that it's about when there are difficult issues in society, bringing people together to learn about issues in depth, and also that they get a chance to really interrogate the issue, but also when they go back into their communities, they will talk with their neighbours, their friends, or their networks about the process and about the material. And I think there is a very important, that dimension of political education is very important. The other benefit, which I think is important from the decision maker point of view, is, there are a number of benefits. One is the understanding, and I think that is an important thing, but also that it improves decision making. And I think a lot of our public policy makes mistakes. and often expensive mistakes. Hundreds of millions of pounds can be plunged into a solution that somebody's cooked up, and it blows up into their face, or it simply doesn't produce the results that they'd hoped for, because it doesn't have that depth of understanding and engagement with the people who it impacts, or gets rejected. And I think from a decision maker point of view, it is really worth investing in these processes in order to improve decision making.
In the next episode of Real Democracy Now, a podcast, I'll be talking to other facilitators about how they approach deliberative mini-publics. I hope you'll join me. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now. You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.